Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week we bring you leading nuclear deterrence experts for a lively discussion on current topics. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Deterrence Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
All right, and welcome back to NucleCast. I, of course, am your host, Adam Lowther, and I am pleased to have with me this evening Miss Patty Jane Geller. So Patty Jane, if you don't know her, she's a young gun, an up-and-coming star in the nuclear world. Patty Jane has a degree from Georgetown. She is also an Air Command and Staff College graduate from Maxwell Air Force Base, where I spent about a decade, so I'm familiar with ACSC. She worked for Elise Stefanik on the Hill before moving to the Senate Armed Services Committee and then joining the Heritage Foundation, where she is now the Senior Policy Analyst who is handling nuclear strategy, nuclear policy, all things nuclear for the Heritage Foundation. So with that, Patty Jane, welcome into NucleCast.
Thanks so much, Adam. It's awesome to join you guys.
Yeah, so tonight I wanted to talk about a number of issues with you. Number one, let me ask you, so as a former Hill staffer and Heritage, I've been involved with Heritage since, you might have been in diapers when I first started dealing with Heritage.
I'm not that young.
So Heritage has long focused on the Hill in trying to influence the Hill. And it oftentimes brings folks from the Hill because Hill experience is important. And so as somebody who's focused on the Hill, who's worked on the Hill, I want to talk about SLCM-N. Mm-hmm. So could you maybe for the audience just remind them what is SLCM-N, and then tell us why it was in the 2018 NPR, and then it was cut from the latest NPR, but Congress has decided to slide a little bit of money in for SLCM-N. What's the story there?
Yeah, absolutely. So SLCM-N, sea-launched cruise missile nuclear, it's nuclear armed cruise missile that we can put on attack submarines or even surface ships that we can deploy directly to a theater of conflict, to the Indo-Pacific or the European seas. And it was initially proposed in the 2018 NPR to fill a gap in U.S. Non-strategic or regional nuclear capabilities. We know that Russia has been growing its arsenal of at least 2,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons, which are those not defined by the New START treaty. They're not strategic systems that might be able to strike the U.S. homeland, but shorter range, lower yield systems like a short range missile or a torpedo. And the U.S. only has a couple of hundred of these tactical weapons in the form of gravity bombs. And then in the Indo-Pacific, it's a whole other story. China deploys hundreds of dual-capable theater-range missiles capable of striking out to Guam in the Indo-Pacific, and the United States forward deploys no nuclear weapons over there. So the SLCM-N was proposed for the very purpose of deterring the limited use of nuclear weapons. And believe it or not, that's the very scenario that we're seeing. That we're worried about in Ukraine today. Putin uses a low-yield nuclear weapon. What do we do? What capabilities do we have? Now it's Ukraine, but what happens if next time it's NATO? So when Biden decided to cancel the SLCM-N, I couldn't understand why. This is, we're behind in our nuclear capabilities. We're facing growing threats. What was the point? And, I wish I knew more. We haven't gotten an unclassified version of the nuclear posture review yet, even though that was due months ago, I believe. And all I've really heard out of the Biden administration is that they're canceling this weapon to meet the political goal of reducing the role of nuclear weapons, which I haven't seen a good, how does that help our national security, or is it just for politics here? And so next you asked me about Congress. Congress decided to reverse that decision. And so we saw the House of Representatives, they actually voted the whole House to authorize funding for the SLCM to keep it going. And then on the Senate side as well, the Senate Armed Services Committee voted to authorize funding for SLCM, and then the Senate Appropriations Committee for Defense voted to, or their bill would authorize funding for SLCM as well. This is significant because we have to remember that it's Biden's own party, the Democrats, that are controlling these committees, controlling these houses here, and they decided to reverse the Biden administration's decision. And I can talk a bit why I think that happened, if you'd like. I don't know if you want to.
Tell me why. Why did it happen?
Yeah, why did it happen? So I think there, like I said, there wasn't. I think Congress couldn't see the justification that I couldn't see either from Biden administration to cancel it. They had several senior military leaders come testify on behalf of the SLCM. You had Admiral Richard, the STRATCOM commander, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the vice chairman as well, General Walters of EUCOM, all told Congress that we need this weapon, for the reason that I discussed. There's a gap in those tactical weapons, and the U.S. needs something to improve our deterrence of limited nuclear use. And I think Congress saw that. It became clear. There was about $45 million authorized for the SLCM. It's not quite enough to keep the program going on its schedule, but I think what's significant here is the policy decision that we need this weapon, and the Biden administration's decision wasn't the way to go.
So I guess one of the questions that some of our podcast listeners might have is, so SLCM, it's a cruise missile, it's a naval cruise missile. They might say, well, why do we really need it? What is it? Why is the president wrong and his team? Why would they be wrong in saying, hey, we've got sufficient capability, we don't really need this?
Yeah, so I already talked about the numeric gap in regional tactical nuclear weapons between the U.S. and its adversaries. But it seems to me like you're asking, why aren't the current forces we have already sufficient? But I think if that were the case, you wouldn't see such, an ongoing buildup from Russia or China. The status quo is changing so much. Russia is supposed to increase that arsenal of non-strategic nuclear weapons. We know about China's strategic breakout and their hundreds of dual capable missiles. If those adversaries are gaining an advantage by getting more of these non-strategic nuclear weapons, and if we do nothing, it only signals to our adversaries that they can, that their buildups are okay. I also, worse, I think it signals to our allies that we're not concerned, or we're not willing to do anything to try and address these new threats. I know that allies for sure would benefit from the SLCM because they can actually see a U.S. nuclear weapon, or maybe not see it with their own eyes, but know that it's there in their own regions.
So one of the other significant questions that has been under consideration with the Nuclear Posture Review, and then the House, Congressman Adam Smith in particular talked about this, is the issue of having a declaratory no first use policy or a sole use policy. And so you've had some in Congress who have advocated it. You've had some in the administration who have advocated it. The NPR does not take a position on no first use or sole use. Could you maybe offer an explanation of what those are, and what are the arguments for them, and then what are the arguments against them?
Sure. So no first use policy and a sole purpose policy, they're essentially the same thing. They both mean that the U.S. would commit to never using nuclear weapons first in the conflict. So in other words, to say that the sole purpose of our nuclear arsenal is to deter nuclear attacks only. And the implication of those policies is that we would not use our nuclear deterrent to deter non-nuclear threats like chemical, biological, major conventional cyber attacks. And the arguments in favor of those policies is that, I'm not really even sure. I think the argument was that this is a way to reduce the role of our nuclear weapons. Maybe if we commit to never using nuclear weapons first, our adversaries will follow suit, or they will, not be in a place where they think the U.S. is going to escalate and compel them to use their own nuclear weapons first. But I think those policies were a bad idea, and I think it's clear that Biden came to the same conclusion. And there are a couple of reasons. I think the worst case of declaring a no first use policy is that our adversaries actually believe that we would never use nuclear weapons first. That would mean that they could be emboldened to escalate right up to the nuclear threshold. But as long as they don't cross it, no matter how big the chemical or biological weapons attack, they don't have to worry about a U.S. nuclear strike. Why would we do anything to make our adversaries worry less? We want to complicate their decision making all the time. And so that's the worst case. The best case is that our adversaries don't believe that we would never use nuclear weapons first, but our allies would. And that's a problem because our allies are the ones who have been kind of freaking out about the idea of a no first use policy. Our allies are the ones who would be on the front lines of a conflict with Russia or China. We're likely to see conflict break out with Russia over NATO and China, over Taiwan or Japan. And, they would be the ones likeliest to be subject to a chemical or a biological weapons attack. So they're very unnerved by a no first use or sole purpose policy. And with, we have some allies who have their own capability to build nuclear weapons if they wanted. We also don't want to do anything to splinter NATO or to splinter our Indo-Pacific alliances, because that's exactly what our adversaries want. So I think the allies reason is a really big one for why the Biden administration ultimately rejected no first use or sole purpose. Because I know that our allies were telling them, hey, please don't do this. I also know that our allies were going and talking to members of Congress saying, we're really worried by this, don't declare this policy. Biden keeps talking about allies and partnerships, restoring those relationships. And I'm sure members of Congress were communicating that to the White House as well.
This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the NucleCast Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. So another big question that I used to, whenever I was an Air Force guy, I would frequently go and speak to staffers on the Hill about nuclear issues, Russia, China, and other things. And the level of interest and knowledge about nuclear issues amongst Hill staffers on the MLAs working for the members. You have a few folks that are permanent staff members on HASC and SAS that are pretty knowledgeable, and they've been there a while. But amongst, in particular, the average member staffer, even MLAs, because they're generally young, the knowledge is pretty low, and the interest is pretty low because if you don't have a nuclear base in your district or in your state, or you don't have a weapons lab, or you don't have a component of the nuclear enterprise, it's largely something you don't think about. So if you, having been a staffer, were to think through how you might improve both knowledge and interest amongst Hill staff, what sort of thoughts or suggestions might you have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'll start by giving the shameless plug for Heritage's work. Our goal is just that, to write policy papers that are easily digestible by Hill staffers. They're not super long reports. They're usually pretty short papers with recommendations. We like to do lunches and briefings for Hill staffers. And, you have organizations like ANWA putting on a bunch of events to educate more as well. Aside from that, I think it's important to talk about why not enough staffers know or are interested in nukes. I think there are a couple of reasons. One is just because up until recently, nuclear weapons, they have been generally viewed, by Congress or the public as kind of a relic of the Cold War. They're super relevant against the Soviet Union. Last 20 years, we've been more focused on counterterrorism. We haven't heard about nukes as much until, of course, recently. So I think that unfortunately, Putin and Xi might do a decent job of renewing the interest in nuclear weapons. We're seeing Putin's nuclear threats in Ukraine. Admiral Richard, the Stratcom commander, just last week actually labeled them. I think it was, he said we're seeing thinly veiled nuclear coercion on the part of Russia. And then we're all hearing about China's crazy strategic breakout. So, it's unfortunate that it's these threats that it might take to get more interest. But I think I've definitely seen more Hill staffers kind of take an interest and worry about it. And the other reason why there might not be enough knowledge or interest is simply because our nuclear production has been dormant for however long. It's only been recently that we initiated or have really gotten going on our modernization programs of both delivery systems and the nuclear weapons complex as well. So I'm hoping that as that gets going, more districts, more states get more heavily involved as we spend more on those programs. There will be even more instance. For instance, you see Senator Tester taking a huge interest in protecting the Sentinel missile program because of what he's got those assets in his state. So I think there's room to improve kind of naturally. We see where the trajectory is going. And I guess the last thing I say, I think we need to focus, and by we, I kind of mean the royal we, is focusing more on getting that message out that nuclear weapons are the number one priority for national security. Admiral Richard has done a good job at spewing that message. Our nuclear arsenal is the backstop to all of our other operational plans. I'm at least trying my best to get that message out. You hear Secretary Austin, the SecDef, saying that nuclear deterrence is the number one priority. I wish we saw that reflected a little bit more in policy. Not canceling SLCM-N, for instance. But I think that's important, kind of drilling that message, because even though we're not employing nuclear weapons daily, like in the way that we're sending our carrier strike groups around, they are number one. And if we don't get nukes right, then I don't think we'll be in a good place.
Now, let me pose my theory as it relates to integrated deterrence. So, I'm a prospect theory guy, and prospect theory says that we overweight risks and losses and we undervalue gains. And so I think that's particularly relevant when it comes to nuclear deterrence, because with nuclear conflict, you have a very severe loss. And so your fear of taking that loss means that you are a risk-averse actor. And that works really, really well whenever it comes to nuclear. I don't think it holds as well with diplomacy or information or economics. We think about the dime. And so therefore, as we think about integrated deterrence, and you're trying to substitute, diplomacy, information, in the dime, there's diplomacy, information, military, and economics. And the nuclear use of nuclear weapons is the M in DIME,
Mhm.
but the DI and the E, I don't see from a prospect theory view that there are really significant losses that an adversary would fear that would make them highly risk averse in the same way that when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons, they're like, oh, geez, man, Armageddon is our big fear. We don't want to mess with that. Let's be let's be careful. I don't see that when if you start to try to say, we'll substitute economic, sanctions, other, or we'll use diplomatic means. I don't see prospect theory holding and creating that risk aversion that I do with the military. So therefore, thus far, I would say I'm unsettled as to whether integrated deterrence will work.
Yeah.
What say you?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Integrated deterrence, it makes sense as kind of a national strategy. Of course, you need to use all elements of the dime, all tools of power to pursue our interests. But integrated deterrence is the Department of Defense's strategy, but the DoD doesn't do diplomacy. They do military. So why are we putting all these other things into the military tool? And like you said, I'm worried that will leave room for things like diplomacy or economic to replace rather than augment the military tool, because this idea that we can solve problems through diplomacy, the reason diplomacy works is when we have the backing of a strong military force. I don't think that they're two things that you can raise or lower or like replace for one or other. I mean, you have to have both. So this idea of integrated deterrence, I hope it doesn't mean at least that we're going to be using less military by the DoD, even though that's their job to make sure we have a strong military so we can utilize all of those other tools.
One of the other things that worries me is, so if deterrence stability equals capability times will, I wonder, our adversaries are clearly looking at each individual administration and each president, and they're saying, will that guy use nuclear weapons? Will that guy respond with military force? Because they understand, American politics is sort of an up and down. It's not stable. Although the Russians may have Vladimir Putin for the last 20 plus years, we're never going to have a national leader in power for 20 plus years. It's just not our system. And we tend to sort of go, Republican, Democrat. And you see vast swings in policies. And I wonder, do you think that those changes in administration, those changes largely in very distinct worldviews and how, a Republican or a Democrat seeks to solve a problem, do you think that shift back and forth is having an impact on the, on the stability and on the perception of will that our adversaries may have?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Half of deterrence is capability, so that might not change so much between presidents, but will, when it comes to will, I do think a president's rhetoric and what he does and says matters. Say what you want about Trump, but our adversaries, they didn't know what he was going to do. He was that could have had an effect. But I worry that Biden, even though he didn't ultimately choose a no first use policy, for instance, the fact that he wanted to do it so badly makes me worried that our adversaries might kind of remember that and say like, well, this guy doesn't want to use nuclear weapons. I don't know. I could be wrong, but it worries me a little bit. And also, things that this administration has done, like cancel Minuteman III tests. That's something we can talk about today. For the third time this year, the administration delayed or canceled a routine scheduled test of our Minuteman III ICBM. And one time is one thing, but 3 times in a row, worries me a little bit. What's this pattern here?
Yeah, so Congress is large. They largely, I mean, they declare war, obviously, but they largely fund the DoD. That's their primary function in our system, is they fund the DoD, and then they have some ability to shape policy and shape the direction of DoD. But I wonder if I see all of these. A few years ago there was amongst the disarmament community, it was the idea of the $1 trillion triad. The $1 trillion triad. It's too expensive. We can't afford it. And as I started, sitting down, and because I like to look and compare the costs of things, and so, for example, the nuclear enterprise for the last 20 plus years has cost the United States about the same amount of money as Americans spend on Coca-Cola each year.
Yeah.
Not Pepsi, not RC, not Diet Coke. Coke.
Just Coke.
Just Coke. That's I did the calculations, and the average American taxpayer spends about $172 a year. That's just taxpayers. If you ain't paying taxes, I'm not including you. So just taxpayers, it's about $172 a year on the, what is ultimately, sovereignty insurance. It's essentially, it's less than a cup of Starbucks coffee a week is what I'm asking you.
And I get that 3 times a week.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then I was looking at waste, fraud, and abuse, and I've mentioned this before, waste, fraud, and abuse in the Medicare and Medicaid programs. And so the Center for Medicare, CMS, Center for Medicare Services, reports that they lose about $70 billion a year in waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicare and Medicaid. That's more than the nuclear enterprise would cost at the height of modernization, and nobody's screaming that we can't afford that waste and abuse. Nobody complains.
Yeah.
And so how do we more effectively explain to Capitol Hill that, the nuclear enterprise it's certainly not what's bankrupting the country. It's not an expensive line item. It's less than 5% of the defense budget. It's less than 1/10 of 1% of the federal budget. How would you and I more effectively convince, those individual MLAs that this is not an expensive line item?
Yeah, I mean, there have been so many attempts. We have the less than 5-6% of the defense budget, less than like 0.01% of the total federal budget. I don't know why it's not sticking. Some members of Congress, some think tank people like to go after the high cost, but you don't really see them going after the high costs of other things like ships, for instance. But I think something that we need to explain is that, again, nuclear weapons are a number one priority, and when you're building a budget, your number one priority is what goes in first. We seem to think like that we can't spend an extra dime on nuclear weapons because we have other things to fund. But if it's your number one priority, that's what you get. If you're going to the grocery store and you only have $20 and you're making chicken for dinner, you got to buy the chicken, and then you buy the spices and the vegetables you have left over for it. It's the same thing. You put nuclear weapons in the budget first, and then you see where you can go. And we're kind of thinking opposite right now, where we can't spend another dime on Slickum N. And I think it's the complete wrong way of looking at this priority. And it kind of goes back to our other conversation of we need to wake up more to the importance nuclear weapons as the backstop. Nothing would work if our nuclear force isn't right.
Now, I would argue that for some reason, and I'm not 100% sure, nuclear weapons have a theological element to them. So they're not just one of many weapons that we purchase. They're one of the few things that there's an attribution of morality to an inanimate object. And I've never quite understood this, and nobody's been able to quite explain it. Do you know why many folks, particularly in the disarmament community, sort of take this almost theological view of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best I can do is think about how they see the destructive power of nuclear weapons. They're the only weapons we have that can existentially threaten another state, cause unprecedented destruction. And I think all that is true, but the issue is that the Russians don't see it that way. If you look at past Soviet behavior and writings and doctrine, they see nuclear weapons as just another weapon. They're more powerful missiles than what they what they already have. And this difference in view is dangerous because it might lead us to think, we would never use nuclear weapons first. Like it's totally impossible. We can never do it. But the Russians, they might think we don't want to use them, but it's another level of escalation in war. And we always talk about how we can't mirror image and things like that, but I'm worried that we're taking our own culture that kind of has developed as nuclear weapons are horrible, destruction in Japan was horrible, all that totally true, but we need to look at them with clear eyes and see what our adversaries are doing and realize that we're going to have to play them at their own game if we don't want them to be taking the advantage.
So let me, we're about out of time. So I want to give you my little genie in the bottle. And
Okay.
I want to give you the chance to rub that genie, that lamp, and the genie pops out and you have one wish.
Ooh.
What is your one wish?
My one wish. My saying slick 'em in is kind of lame because we know that I like the slick 'em in. I've been talking about it. My one wish is for Congress. My one wish is for Congress to, take very seriously the new China nuclear threat. Our nuclear force posture was designed for the 2010 nuclear threat environment. When we designed our ongoing modernization posture, our modernization plans, we didn't predict a Chinese strategic breakout. And my worry is that we're not going to do anything to change our force posture, do anything about this new threat we're seeing. So my one wish is that I'm wrong about that, and that Congress steps up and they, lose the taboo against new nuclear weapons or more nuclear weapons, and we see them step up to the plate and get us what we need for the threats of today and the future. How's that?
All right, wonderful. So, we are out of time. So I want to thank Patty Jane Geller from the Heritage Foundation for joining us on this episode of NucleCast and talking Congress, slick 'em in, no first use, and many interesting topics, of course. So thanks again for joining us, and we will certainly have you back on NucleCast.